And we're back.
New rating system alert, new rating system alert. I got tired of this 5-point system that didn't have enough parity. I felt like 90% of games I set up to be 3s or 4s based on the old definitions, and plus, I'm over number scores. Here's how I'm rating these games now. Pinnacle of the genre, put it at the top of your wish list, get to it eventually, it's up in the air, maybe avoid this one, and inspired by my Gotham Knights video, legitimately made my life worse. No spoilers for any of these games except for one, but I'll be putting a warning and giving everyone a chance to skip. Also, I know I'm late, shut up, leave me alone. Let's start things off with a game that I actually started at the end of October and still haven't finished yet, Bayonetta 3. This game's got a lot of love online. I know some people who follow me are big fans of it. I think it's okay. The gameplay is great. Some of the weapons feel a little bit more useless than others. Not sure why I'd pick a slow trident that transforms you into a frolicking frog when I could literally be a choo-choo train from hell, but as far as your options and combos go, this is pretty comprehensive. There's a lot of absolutely wild scenes. The game goes full anime. It'll just throw a bunch of unique little gameplay segments at you. In the first half hour, you're riding around a crumbling city on a dragon and then hop into the water and the dragon gets jet ski skates. Whoever made these decisions was on exactly the right amount of acid. That aside, though, I do have a lot of issues with the game. A lot of people have talked about the lack of visual clarity, and that's definitely a problem. The amount of effects and size of enemies and everything just gets too much at times. But a bigger problem is I found the game did a bad job of encouraging you to diversify your playstyle. I'm pretty bad at these stylish, combo-based games, I'll openly admit that, but usually I feel like they do a better job of breaking me out of my comfort zone through visual distinctions and active feedback. I'm probably gonna do a whole video on this discussing stuff like skill meters and how they affect things, but the fact that Bayonetta only gives me a rating after the fight is over means I had a hard time experimenting with what boosted my score. And sometimes I'd feel like I had a great fight and get a bronze medal, while other times I do pretty badly and get a gold. I know it sounds like a small thing, but as my first Bayonetta game and as somebody who's not a natural at this style of gameplay, I found it really hard not to just spam buttons at times, especially because the game actually rewarded me for it. It's also clearly suffering from being on a system that's so outdated at this point. It is not great to look at despite its many amazing set pieces. Also, I think that Viola's moveset wasn't as enjoyable as Bayonetta's, and the side-scrolling sections were a fun shake-up, but never reached close to the heights of the 3D stuff. It's like Metroid's distant cousin, Metroid other M once removed. Both of these sections pop up just enough to throw off the pacing for me, and you add in a story that I couldn't care less about, and while I get the love for this game, while I still had a good time with a lot of it, I just didn't end up as ecstatic about it as everyone else. I'd say get it eventually, especially if it's your first run-in with the series. If you're a fan already though, you'll probably really like this. Somerville is a weird one. When I first played it, it was kind of a mix of frustration and fascination. There were a lot of technical problems that I outlined in my review, and for such a cinematic and artistic game, that was pretty jarring, but I was also floored by some of the imagery and art at work. I was pretty positive on the game aside from its technical failings because I associated most of my annoyances with it on those issues, and I thought if those were ever brushed up, the game would be amazing. With a few weeks past, I gotta admit, I'm a little bit softer on it. I noticed that the narrative and how it was laid out didn't really stick with me. Only a couple of the puzzles were clever and the rest were pretty straightforward, and I'm even more harsh on the technical side because there was no reason for it to have been like this considering how much it relies on pulling you into the world. I said without the bugs and frame rate issues, it was probably one of the better games of the year, but I already feel like that's maybe giving it too much credit, which is unfortunate because it had a whole lot of potential, and the artistic parts of it, mainly its visuals and audio, are top of the line, can't get better than this territory. I still think people should get it, especially on sale or if you have Game Pass, but it's already lost some of its impact on me. After talking about two games that came out in the last month or so, let's turn the clock all the way back to 2002. I wish I could tell you that I played Sly Cooper on the PS2 for the optimal experience, but I don't have a PS2, so instead I streamed it on PSN, and here's a dramatic recreation of what that looked like. Honestly though, real talk, streaming it wasn't that bad for the most part, although the input lag is insanely frustrating. The original Sly Cooper is a solid, level-based collectathon-esque platformer with a fun style and premise, and no options to uninvert the shooting controls, thanks 2002. Playing through this, I can tell why it was so beloved back in the day, and I am rooting for a revival because the stealth elements are unique for a 3D platformer and can be really cool to see today, but it's also aged sort of poorly. I did get through it all, but all of the minigames handled badly, and I can't say precision was a major strong suit of this game, although I did find it hilarious that it has these cover fire sniping levels because Days Gone was still doing that 17 years later. This goofy ass Boozer cover mission. Basically, there are two PS2 games that I played through PSN on this list. One of them managed to still handle well. This was not it. I hope these games get remade or rebooted or something because the ingredients are there, and I actually will be going through all of the Sly games eventually, but in its current state, this one's up in the air. It's not horrible, but I really wouldn't tell many people to go out and play it. Here's a quick one, Ghostrunner. Why is it quick? Because I already put it in one of these videos just a few months ago. I'm replaying it again. It's joined Sekiro as one of my comfort games. I think think I just like fast games with swords. And at this point, it's honestly one of my favorite indies ever. It's got the most generic storyline of all time, but goddamn if it also doesn't have one of the most addicting gameplay loops. I genuinely think this is one of the best and most unique action platformers out there, especially with all of the additions to it over the years, the time trials, challenge modes, DLC. If you like good movement and that quick one-hit kill gameplay, you won't regret playing this. In preparation for God of War Ragnarok, I bought the audiobook for Neil Gaiman's Norse mythology. Why the audiobook and not the regular book? Because I'm not a goddamn nerd, okay? I don't own books. My whole childhood was defined by mythology. Admittedly, Norse was a bit of a blind spot of mine, but like a lot of kids, I was a big fan of the Percy Jackson books and Riordan's other series like the Kane Chronicles, and I was so into them at the time that I bought dozens of collections and retellings of classic Greek and Egyptian myths, so this really took me back. You don't need me to tell you that Gaiman is an incredible writer, you already knew that. Coraline, Sandman, American Gods, Good Omens, and I like how quickly and succinctly he captures the personalities of all the big players and throws in a good amount of fun, insignificant stories with the major events. I definitely recommend checking it out. I rewatched BoJack Horseman this month. I've watched the show a couple of times already, and it's easily one of my favorite shows ever made. It has such an odd mix of casual viewing with dark, ongoing plot lines. It always maintains this impossible balance of humor and tragedy, and it does it all in a more organic way than most other shows do. I think a lot of shows that have that dual-toned edge kind of whip back and forth between the two within seasons, within episodes. They just feel a little bit divorced from one another, especially if it's a comedy first, and BoJack falls into the same issues in season 1 in my opinion, but after that, it weaves together so seamlessly, and each time I watch it, I like the ending more and more. At first I was a bit unsure about it, but I think it's really appropriate for a lot of the show's themes. Go watch the show, idiot! And I also rewatched Everything Everywhere All at Once, and I came to the conclusion that it's a little bit overrated. Jesus, alright, hold on. Calm down. Listen, I agree with most praises of this movie. The editing is incredible, it is so stylish and imaginative, there's so much great choreography and visual effects despite not being a big budget blockbuster, but the structure of this movie is exhausting. There's like 18 climaxes in this film, 17 if you remove the butt plug scene, think about it, and it feels like the movie is an hour longer than it is. Every time it felt like the resolution was happening, we'd be reminded of this whole other personal conflict between different characters, and then it'd all explode into action for 2 minutes and then completely stop and go into a conversation of them resolving an issue for a bit, and then bam, another thing. I did of course like the contrasting and parallelizing of a lot of different realities, but they all had such opposing tempos that it felt unbelievably dragged out. It is a great, fun-ass movie with so many positive elements, it's absolutely worth seeing, but both times I've watched it, I've had issues with the pacing. It's good. You guys know it's good. I have a full dedicated video on God of War Ragnarok's narrative already, but to summarize, wowee! There's some pacing issues here as well, but even if I wish some stuff had been shuffled around in terms of how much time it was given, everything eventually had a purpose, and watching it back there were a lot of little details for a lot of characters that foreshadowed what's to come. It's sometimes a bit on the nose with its messages, but who cares? It's a massive epic with so many important figures, so much passion and action, so many little details that it's hard not to love it. The gameplay got some nice tweaks, it can sometimes feel a little bit samey to 2018, but they added new RPG elements for a little bit of depth, they revamped some of the old moves, added environmental elements, lots of small things, but they add up. I mentioned that one game that I was going to talk about had a spoiler, so here it is. I'll give you a second to skip to this timestamp. Okay, I was a little bit underwhelmed by the spear at first, but after some upgrades it really holds its own and it was the perfect weapon choice for certain boss fights. And even though I criticized Viola's sections in Bayonetta for being simpler, I actually really liked Atreus' sections here. The companions in his sections actually hold their own, so fights feel quicker, they don't make you feel weak. Atreus himself is really nimble and has the potential for some crazy combos, and it helps that his side of the story is even more engaging than when you play as Kratos. I agree that whacking fodder enemies with a bow isn't the peak of the series, but these sections were spread out enough for me to see them as nice palette cleansers. There's way more bosses here than last time and some amazing ones at that. It looks better, it sounds better, and most of my complaints are too minor to really get into here. It's at the pinnacle of the genre, play it right now. Who am I kidding? You probably already have. Electronic Superjoy is in sharp contrast to Ragnarok just in what it is. It's a very simple 2D platformer with a buzzing soundtrack and hanky-panky noises when you hit a checkpoint. Oh yeah! I apologize to anybody playing this video out loud. The second game is actually completely free permanently on Steam, so you could also start with that if you want to come in with no risk, but it's a game that does what it wants to do and then gets out of your hair. The music is in your face, the platforming is really tough, and maybe not as smooth as other games, but it's kind of going for that hard-nosed, quick reflexes vibe, so that's not a huge deal. And everything else is... well, there's really not much of anything else. Like I said, it does what it came to do and then swiftly exits. I wouldn't say that this should go to the top of your wish list, but the series is cheap or free on every platform, so you should find your way to getting to it eventually if you're a big platformer buff. Everybody's already said it, but Evil West feels like a PS3 game in the best way. I think the biggest problem with this game is its repetitive nature. I did get burnt out on the loop eventually, although I sort of got my mojo back in the last hour. I think the game should have given out more currency and perk points throughout the campaign, because when you eventually have more tools, it balances out the much larger, longer, tankier encounters, whereas without them you kind of start feeling like you're punching above your weight. In the middle section, it really felt like there was a bit of a disconnect there, whereas the early and late sections do a better job of balancing out your capabilities against your enemies. There's a good handful of fun, electricity-infused moves, solid enemy diversity, and even co-op, although that was a little bit busted. The game wouldn't let the visiting player use things like heal or the arena-wide shockwave, which are both on cooldown and insanely useful. It was clearly an error. It wasn't designed this way. This was not meant to be happening, because sometimes it would work how it was supposed to, but 9 out of 10 times it just wouldn't complete the animation, and that was pretty annoying. Still, it's good old-fashioned monster slaying, it's got a high production value, it's got good performances despite me not really caring about the story, way better in that department than Shadow Warrior 3, and it's simultaneously super generic and pretty unique in today's landscape. I'd wait for a sale and get to it eventually, just because I think this would have been better as like a $40 game instead of $60. It's actually a little bit cheaper on Steam than it is for console, I don't know why, but it's a fun romp through and through. I finally finished Hickman's Fantastic Four run, and I enjoyed the second half a lot more than the first. I still dug the first half, but if you remember, I also felt a little bit lost early on. I know it's a bit of a staple with Hickman, he really pulls it all through in the end, but it's also a touch frustrating sometimes reading a bunch of issues and then just being confused, and then you read to the end and it makes sense, but you also maybe missed a lot of details of the earlier sections. What he does as a writer is impressive, but it's also hard to grab onto as a new-ish reader. Although the absolutely insane ideas that crop up in the second half of this run are so worth it. The power levels that we're dealing with in a non-Avengers book is off the charts, and the way Hickman makes even death and resurrection, which is a tired comic trope, actually feel engaging is worthy of applause. The Fantastic Four can be so cool. Please, for the love of God, Marvel, don't mess this up. I also finished Scott Snyder's run on Batman and had a bit of the opposite reaction. It was still good, but the first half felt tighter to me. The early stories like The Court of Owls and Death of the Family almost felt like limited series, which I really enjoy, and then the second half felt more like your typical longer comic run. That's not a bad thing. I mean, it was a longer run and not a limited series, but that's just not what I'm more of a fan of. Great writer, great run, but peaked in the first half for me personally. And keeping the comic theme going but moving over to the big screen, I watched Black Panther Wakanda Forever. Why are people so mixed on this movie? I understand that the plot itself is on the generic side, but this feels like a blockbuster movie that was a distinctly human experience. I got so into the characters, their opinions on culture, their love and loss, it just felt very real to me. The ways different characters reacted to losing a loved one or multiple, I've seen those reactions in real life, and they were played to perfection. Characters doubting culture and the general depiction of faith was also something that felt very real growing up in a super religious household, and to me that just makes the movie so much stronger. I've seen a lot of this before, strictly speaking, but I haven't felt it before. To me, Wakanda Forever is significantly better than the first Black Panther, which I always thought was sort of meh, and I'd love to see future Marvel movies incorporate more of this personal feel. I feel like that's the biggest thing most are missing right now. Absolver? I hardly know her. Absolver is a game with a lot of bright ideas, but some fundamental issues that will probably throw a lot of people off. Its style is a bit of a precursor to Sifu, which looks amazing, but here while there are a few nice locations, sometimes it feels less minimalist and more empty and bland. Not to mention, it was not running well, even on a PS5. Combat is basically all this game cares about, which makes it a bit of a shame that it's so easily exploitable. There are a lot of tools in this combat system: directional parries, attack feints, stance changes, attack slots, and schools, and a bunch of other stuff that I didn't understand, and I feel like if you go digging, you'll find gold here, especially in PvP. That said, I was having an unbelievably tough time understanding the parry window, and after a bit of frustration, I learned that you can literally caveman brain your way through everything. Trying to play it in the way that it wanted me to meant I kept getting stomped out, but unlike other tough games that funnel you into a way that forces you to learn and improve, I realized that pressing triangle for a strong attack and breaking an enemy's guard was the most reliable way of doing damage, especially if I just spammed it and then dodged back a bit for my stamina to recharge, and so that's all I did. And when I made that change, I got through the game way faster with way less deaths. In fact, I decided to fight the final boss using none of my tools except heavy attack and dodge just to see what would happen, and I won on my first try. Absolver is a game that demands a lot from you, but at the same time you can cut corners and avoid frustration and somehow be rewarded. One of my Discord members called this his second favorite combat system of all time, but sorry boss, I gotta say maybe avoid this one. The original God of War aged really well visually and gameplay wise. It feels surprisingly slick even today. It did not age well level level design and puzzle-wise, there are some long, drawn-out sections. If you thought Ragnarok had too many puzzles, at least they were all relatively quick. God of War 1 feels padded out by stuff that's usually not very fun to do, but you can't deny the basic hack-and-slash expertise and the great setting and backstory. It also deserves a remake that'll hopefully tweak some of its core elements, but right now I'ma say maybe get to it eventually. It's not lost in time, but it does have some dull stretches. And let's wrap this up with a genre that I hardly ever talk about because I basically never play: racing. Let's just say that I like my Need for Speeds the way that I don't like my women. Unbound. I feel like NFS finally found what its style should be. It's been throwing things at the wall for so long, and finally it's just leaned into the aesthetic that it's always had hints of and puts it at the front. I can't speak to it too much because I only played the trial, but even though the substance here doesn't feel particularly revamped from previous games, the style does help in my opinion. The characters look out of place, my guy always looks like he's trying to smooch somebody for some reason, and I also made him look like the whitest man you could possibly imagine, which has nothing to do with the quality of the game. I just think it's funny to have Wonder Bread here participate in illicit activities and listen to hip-hop. But the music and visual effects at the very least makes Need for Speed interesting to an outsider again. And I think the next step is to take this idea and put an even more arcadey game around it. I feel like that's where we're headed. NFS has always been a bit more arcadey than the serious racing sims, but I still wanted to lean into that a bit more. And clearly people are digging this more than the last few, so you might as well. If you have Game Pass or EA Play, go check out the trial. It's 10 hours long. Otherwise, I mean, I wouldn't buy it because I'm not a huge racing fan, but if you are, this is a solid top of your wish list. That's everything I played in November. Let me know what you guys played and what you thought about any games on this list. Remember to subscribe, join the Discord, it's in the description, and I'll see you all next time. Peace.